Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I'm really proud and excited to welcome Courtney to Seattle. Courtney is a former archaeologist and a Sierra Club activist, and he has spent his career focusing on how to build bridges between ranchers and conservationists. To this effect, he founded the Kuvira Coalition in 1997, and the Kuvira Coalition is a nonprofit working to find and implement practices that improve economic and ecological resilience in Western working lands. Courtney has written a number of books, including Revolution on the Range and The Indelible West, which is a collection of black and white photographs with a foreword by Wallace Stegner, I think a hero of many of ours. In addition to all this serious work, Courtney raises a backyard full of chickens at his home in Santa Fe and manages a herd of cattle on the open range. He's joining us tonight to discuss his most recent book, and this is why I have notes, because I can't remember the title yet. I'll memorize it. 2% Solutions for the Planet, 50 Low-Cost, Low-Tech, Nature-Based Practices for Combating Hunger, Drought, and Climate Change. So before I bring Courtney up, I just want to give you a little personal testimonial to the impact of Courtney's work in the West. About 10 years ago, I was a beginning rancher in Idaho, running about 10,000 sheep on about 1 million acres, and we had put together this ranch to try to achieve landscape-scale conservation, conserve wildlife, and run an economically viable outfit that would support all that conservation work. Great vision, really difficult to do. And I was sort of despairing over a number of issues, including the fact that wolves had come back into our area after 70 years. We had a firm commitment to running a predator-friendly ranch, and so we really were stumped on how we were going to coexist with these incredible animals. And I opened up a publication by the Kuvira Coalition, and there was an article about a guy named Todd Graham who was sleeping with his cattle on pastures up on the Sun Ranch in Montana because he was dealing with the same thing. Wolves were coming back into the landscape, and he was trying to sort out what practices he could use to keep his cattle safe and not rely on lethal control of those wolves. So I thought the Kuvira Coalition, that sounded clever and interesting. So I ended up going to a conference that Kuvira was hosting in Albuquerque, and I remember walking in to this conference center, and there were literally hundreds of ranchers and conservationists having a conversation about how to bridge divides and work together to sustain the incredible landscapes and communities of the West. And I realized that I had thought I was working in isolation, and suddenly I realized I was part of a movement and was able to just get incredible coaching and mentoring and support from this incredible community that really Courtney deserves credit for building. So with that, I'll turn it over to Courtney and give him a nice, warm Northwest welcome.
I'm going to pull this out and wander around on the stage here a little bit. I thank everybody. Thanks, Mike, so much. That was a wonderful introduction and good to hear. It's good to hear that way back when, because I also thought we were working in isolation at the time, and I'll explain a little bit more about it. And then we eventually all kind of came together, and it's great to hear these stories again and see the effects over all these years. And now Mike is the state director for Nature Conservancy here in Washington. That's a testimony to him and to the organization and to this movement that we started about 25 years ago. So I want to take you on a little bit of a journey. I feel like I'm staring right into these bright lights here. In the Southwest. I'm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's where the organization is. I want to talk a little bit about the Kuvira Coalition, about this movement that we started in collaborative conservation, and then kind of move through our journey, our story, which takes us into food and some ecological restoration issues, and then eventually into climate and some things that we're doing today, which flow into the books. Hopefully it'll all make sense kind of at the end. And please, as we go through this, I know there's a question and answer period at the end. If you have anything kind of burning that you want to say, just raise your hand. I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along here. So we're going to talk about the Kuvira Coalition first. This is the nonprofit that I started in the mid-1990s, 1997. These are the different kinds of activities. I'm going to tell you about my journey through this organization and through what we're doing today. I like to tell folks that I'm a former Sierra Club activist who became a dues-paying member of the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association. Neither organization, I think, was pleased with that development. But eventually, at the time, and I'll explain a bit more how we became a conservation group that went into cattle ranching for a period of time as a way of doing conservation on this landscape. And then where it kind of led us from there. So my background is I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm a desert boy. I have a Northwestern connection. I went to college in Portland, Oregon, and then I met my wife there, and eventually she's from Albuquerque. We went back to New Mexico and the dry blue skies of the Southwest, so it's neat to be back. I haven't been in Seattle in 25 years. I'm heading up to the San Juan Agricultural Summit on San Juan Island tomorrow, which is a group of farmers that do this kind of work. So. Kuvira is an old Spanish colonial word. The Spanish, when they came to New Mexico in the early 1600s, were looking for this kind of mythical landscape, always kind of just over the horizon. So when I wanted to put this nonprofit together, we decided to use that word Kuvira. It kind of means unknown territory. At the time, we were trying to bring ranchers and environmentalists together, very much an unknown territory kind of landscape. In the beginning, we were just looking for kind of touch points, places where ranchers and environmentalists could get along, and literally we're just little groups of people out there in the landscape. It grew eventually over time into this vision, which I'll come back to at the end of the talk, which is part of the books that are out there. Eventually, I tried to think of all the different regenerative, resilient, sustainable activities on these different landscapes, and I tried to put it all into this map, which I'll explain. I don't know if folks remember the 1990s. In the Southwest, we had nothing but fighting going on between ranchers and environmentalists. It was the grazing wars. Up here, I think it was the timber wars, the endangered species wars. It was trench warfare between these different user groups in the West. I lived in Santa Fe at the time. I got involved with the Sierra Club there for some national political concerns of mine at the time. When Newt Gingrich ran to took over the federal Congress and threatened a bunch of environmental laws, I got involved in the Sierra Club. What can I do? And this was the tenor of the time. You couldn't open the newspaper almost every day and not see some kind of confrontation between ranchers and environmentalists. We decided to put a little nonprofit together, try to find some common ground here. And what I suspected at the time was that ranchers and environmentalists had more in common than in difference if you got beyond the politics. If you actually went out on the ground and talked about grass and water and animals and that sort of stuff. So we put this little nonprofit together in 1997. We literally wanted to start over at the level of the grass and the roots. I kind of like to think of Kuvira as the sort of ultimate grassroots organization because we really wanted to go out and just look at grass and roots. So we would actually dig little trenches under these spots and on ranches, well-managed ranches, and just start this conversation. What are we looking at? What's here? What's the problem? How do we solve it? We had a lot of workshops in the early days that were directed at both conservationists and ranchers. A lot of folks came. It told me at the time there actually was a hunger for finding this common ground, that folks beyond the kind of the conflict industry, we call it, the folks who like to fight on both sides of this equation, beyond those folks, there was a strong desire to find some kind of way to bring these groups together. We started an annual conference, that's what Mike alluded to. It's still going. It's going to be in its 15th year. It's in Albuquerque in the fall. And the idea was to find kind of a neutral place where folks could come and talk to each other. We call it the radical center. It was a term that was invented by a rancher in southern Arizona, Bill McDonald, of the Malpai Borderlands Group. And the idea was that there's a center between these extremes. It's pragmatic, practical, profitable. You come together, work these problems out. That makes it radical. The idea that we're not going to shoot at each other, we're actually going to come together. And at the time, in the mid-90s, as I'm sure Mike can tell you, this was a pretty radical idea, the idea that folks would actually try to try to work things out, and especially in this political culture right now, it's kind of a wild idea. And I get folks saying to me, Courtney, how do you get the radical center going? And we can maybe come back to this at the end of the talk. How do you get kind of a radical centrism politically in the kind of the culture and society we have today? But back then, we're dealing with some of the same issues, but focused on ranching and conservation. So it wasn't just kumbaya. We weren't trying to just sort of, how do we get along? Can we get along? We are, excuse me, we're trying to promote a suite of land management practices that we consider to be sustainable, resilient. For example, in the cattle ranching world, putting the herd of animals together and moving them around the landscape. This is a herd of 800 cattle in Colorado, where the ranchers actually pulled up all the different allotments into one group and moved it through the mountains. I'll come back to this in a bit. And what they do there and other places is control the intensity and timing of those animals on that landscape. So cattle, they're domesticated animals, but they're related to wild herbivores, genetically. They've lost their herding instinct largely. And the idea of most of these ranchers is to put those animals together in a unit and move them across this landscape like the bison would move. So these landscapes, which have been grazed by herbivores for 66 million years, not by cattle, of course, but if you can mimic that grazing behavior, that natural way that animals group up and move around and eat grass and move on, that's what these ranchers were trying to do. So this is when I met a rancher, Jim Winder, which I'll explain a little bit. This is kind of what we were trying to mimic, that kind of behavior, but using domesticated animals to do that targeted or planned grazing. The ranchers we worked with, and when I first got into this, was amazed. This is Todd Graham's ranch up in the Sun Ranch when he was there. They used just a single strand electric wire to control those animals, and then they planned the grazing out so that no part of the ranch gets grazed more than once a year for just a couple days. They can build that fence in about 3.5 hours, put the cows in it, they eat, they move out, and off they go. And it's again, it's a natural process. Herbivores eating grass and then moving on and not coming back. It's how nature wants these landscapes to be grazed. So this is Jim Winder. I met Jim at a Sierra Club meeting. I walked into a statewide meeting in southern New Mexico, and there was a cowboy hat on the table. This was 1996. I said, what is a rancher doing in a Sierra Club meeting? And Jim liked to say later, yeah, and I'm a Republican too. What was I doing there in this meeting? A Sierra Club activist. Jim had joined the Sierra Club. He was trying to figure out what was the nature of this conflict, how we can get beyond it. Jim was one of these new ranchers. The way that he managed his ranch, he bunched those cows up, put them in particular paddocks and moved them around. I met Jim. I saw kind of a light went on. I said, here's a way to kind of get through this crisis and this conflict by working together for some common goals. We ended up calling, and Jim liked to talk about something you don't see in the West at the time very much, the legless cow. So lots of grass here. So we ended up calling it the New Ranch, and it's just a kind of a name that we kind of applied to this idea of being that the same ecological processes that make land healthy for wildlife are the same processes that make it healthy for livestock production. So it's called land health. It's basic ecological functioning. It's not a new idea. Aldo Leopold, the famous American conservationist, worked these ideas out in the 20s and 30s when he was down in New Mexico and then eventually in Wisconsin. These are his basic definitions of what land health is. And conservation is our ability to understand and preserve this capacity for self-renewal. Self-renewal just means basic ecological functions, mineral cycle, water cycle, those kinds of things, round and round. And Leopold was the first to draw a connection between overgrazing and erosion in the Southwest. These are some pretty good illustrations of how this works. This is what is overgrazed here, ungrazed or well managed over here, leading to erosion, these kinds of issues. I like this graphic because it shows you that the issue isn't simply cattle, it's how the cattle are managed. Again, the cows eat the same no matter where they are. How long they're there, how much they eat before they move away is the issue. There's a way of doing it right and a way of doing it wrong. Land health is the metric which you can see if it's being done properly. This is a map that really changed my thinking a lot. back in 2002 when I saw this. This is a 600,000 acre wildlife refuge well, the valley is 600,000 acres, and a lot of private land and a wildlife refuge here. If you look right in the middle here, this red part, this is just looking at land function or land health. It's just looking at grass, soil, and water, how they intersect. If it's managed well, it's green. If it's managed poorly, it's red. Here's a good example. That look like a healthy landscape to you? No. Not much grass here. This is a private lands ranch right in the middle of that valley. By looking at those indicators, those criteria of ecological or land health, this is a red zone. This is not a healthy landscape. There were cattle there. They were taken off because there was nothing to eat. So it's still in private lands. It's still a ranch, but that time they took the cattle off. So that was up here, right here, Palo Alto. Here is another landscape. Does that look healthy to you? It's kind of like sort of the same. Not a lot of grass, okay? It's a national wildlife refuge, and it hadn't been grazed by cattle in almost 20 years when we took this picture. It also was red on this map. And the point is, I'm not trying to say cattle are good or bad, or rest, or protection is good or bad. I'm just saying, is the land functioning properly? Is it healthy? Let's just start there. Let's ask these questions. Is it functioning properly? If it's not, what do we do to get it back into health? What can we do to get it to be functioning properly again? And this all comes out of some federal science work that was done around the turn of the last century, 2000. So we're just looking at grass, soil, and water. So here's a pop quiz. Now that you've been primed, which side of the fence is healthy, not healthy? Which looks healthier to you, right? So the right side. Now, can anybody take a quick guess? And I probably led you into this. Which side? Where were the cows? This is a fence line between public and private land. The cattle were on the right-hand side. The cattle were there for 5 days. It's a little trap. They're put in there. They stirred the soil up, and then they left, and the rains came, and the grass grew. And I'm not trying to make a point about which are cows good or bad. I'm asking the question, is it healthy or not healthy? And then you ask why. Why is it in this condition? What can we do about it? So this is a situation where this had not been disturbed by hooves or anything for a long period of time. This was disturbed by the cattle, and the rains came, and off they went. Same question. Which side of this fence looks healthy? Which side does not look healthy, and why? Any guesses? Okay, so there's lots of green on the left, there's lots of gray on the right. Anybody take a guess as to what the difference between these two sides of the fence are? This is in Texas. What's that? So there's lots of grass here. There's grass here, so it's not a matter of being grassless. But the grass doesn't look vibrant, right? It looks like it's frankly asleep, dormant. Senescent is the term that they use. So this is a working, well-managed cattle ranch on this side. This is CRP land. Do folks know what CRP is? This is land that was taken out of production in way back when, and usually in the Dust Bowl era, in order to protect it. And so it hasn't had any disturbance, hasn't had grazing, fire, whatever. It's also rested from livestock or rested from herbivores moving around. So just again, the question is what's healthy, what's not healthy, and then why. So this was the new ranch. This was kind of our idea at the time, working with Jim and some of these other ranchers. We thought we were in isolation at that point, but we met other ranchers. So very quickly, grazing is a natural process. It's been going on in North America for 66 million years, not by cattle, but by herbivores. And disturbance is a critical part of these ecosystems. If you go way back when, we used to put fires out in the forest. We realized that fire is part of the ecosystem process. Grazing is going through the same sequence where people realize that grazing has a role in these ecosystems. And then finally, the key is good range management, timing, intensity, and frequency, which I discussed. So this was published in a book. Somebody has a question. Yes, so the question about manure, fertilizer, urine, yes. Yeah, you bet. So think about a big herd of buffalo or bison, right? Big, like 1 million animals like they used to have running across the Midwest. Okay, think about the amount of manure and urine that herd is generating. that's fertilizing that landscape. Yeah, you bet. So this is part of the process of animals working in natural ways, mimicking natural behavior, and also their byproducts, right? What's that? Water it. In New Mexico, we get 12 inches of rain, and it's a big empty state. So watering, we don't have much water to start off with. And when the rains come, if you think of those two slides I showed you, when the rains do come, which side is going to soak up that water better or run off? I'm going to get into this a little bit in a minute. If you have if you have grass cover, then the rains soak in and infiltrate and go down. If it's missing grass cover, it runs off, right? And then down it goes. And we're going to get into this in a dramatic way in just a little bit. So yes, manure. Nature. There's an old saying in organic agriculture: nature never farms without animals, which is really an interesting way of thinking about this. In nature, animals move around. They graze and they defecate. And this is good. I mean, this is how nature kind of handles these systems. Not domesticated cattle per se, but animals in general, animals that move around. So we'll come back to this. So this was, as I said before, an example of the radical center. I won't go into this too much. This was something that we kind of thought a lot about at the time. You have conservation, collaborative. Mike talked a little bit about this, kind of the idea of folks coming together in meetings, often in rooms, sitting in chairs. And then you have the land health part of it, which is generally the science, the ecologists, folks kind of understanding what the science is here. And then down there you have the rancher. You have the kind of models of sustainable use. If everybody's in their corner, not talking to the other folks in the other corners, you don't have much going on. You can go to meeting after meeting after meeting, or if the scientist is just out there by himself in the land, herself. But if you have all three working together, it enlarges this middle, and this is the radical center. This is how things get done. Nature Conservancy is a good example of an organization that pioneered this kind of idea, especially down in the boot hill of New Mexico. And I look at this now and I think about kind of our national political situation. How could we energize kind of a radical center where you pull evenly on these different parts and enlarge something in the middle and get something done? Well, we can talk about that later. I won't go into this right now. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about kind of the next stage for Kuvira and how it kind of led to where we are now. This is 2001. We met this man, Bill Zedike. Bill is a retired Forest Service biologist who reinvented himself as a restoration specialist, fixing creeks. He said, I like to fix creeks. I'm going to go through what Bill taught us and how we helped him and what it's kind of led to. So this is another pop quiz. What do you think this is? It looks bad, right? So we know from a land health perspective, this is probably not a healthy system. Anybody here think this is actually a creek? It's not a creek. It captured the creek, but it was something else historically. Can anybody guess what this is? Dry New Mexico. Something historical. Flash floods caused it, but something caused the flash floods to go into this system. It's an old wagon road. It's an old wagon road. The ruts caught the water over time, and these are soils, I don't know about Washington, but the soils where we are very easily erodible, friable, we call them. So down it went with flash flood events upstream, and some poor grazing management upstream creates a lot of water kind of moving down through the system. But here's the image that really kind of opened my eyes. So these are fence posts hanging in the air. And this is a ranch in western New Mexico that we were working on. We were working with the rancher to try and change his grazing management. He was in a terrible conflict with the Forest Service at the time, the lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. He was open to changing his management. As we walked around the ranch, I saw these kinds of issues, and eventually we came to this. I walked right up that creek. I asked the rancher what was going on here, and he said that those fence posts sat on the ground in 1937. Now, if you kind of block off the top here a little bit, and you just look at the bottom part, you say, well, yeah, we know, it looks bad, but that fence gives you a dramatic metric on how much erosion has happened. I asked a government agent, NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, I asked him, how much the rest of New Mexico is in this condition? He said, most of the state is in this condition. And this is what Aldo Leopold was writing about in the 20s, because he drove around looking at all these different terrible situations. So we have a big problem. It's not just overgrazing, whatever, cows. It's also these erosion issues in New Mexico, because when these things happen, the water table drops that far. So Bill knows this, and having worked for the Forest Service for his entire career, he saw a lot of this firsthand. So he began to work on a methodology and how to get these systems back into health. This is a land health question. Now we're looking at riparian areas, which are the streams. So this is a good example. We got in this system. It's the same system. You can see how it's. Bill calls them adobe tubes. Adobe is kind of a slick mud. If you get water on it, a lot of clay in it. These systems will straighten up and cut down over time. So Bill came up with a methodology, which I'll explain here in a sec, where you put things in the system here, slow water down. You can see the creek has turned here from this one very simple structure. These are my children who are now 18 years old. Kind of a sense of how this works. Here's a very good example. This is where the floodplain used to be. The system is now incised through those flood events, cutting the bank, causing a lot of erosion. A lot of regulating agencies are very concerned about it, sediment transport, that kind of stuff. But here's a structure that we built, and after one flood event, you can see how he's turned the creek already. Instead of biting into here, he's turned the creek this way. This is a simple, pretty simple schematic of how this works. So here's the channel, the adobe tube that badly eroded, and then they straighten up and they cut down. And by putting these structures in place here, the system begins to re-meander. In fact, Bill invented a term called induced meandering. He's inducing meandering here with very simple structures. And then eventually you get the system to re-meander. Nature wants these creeks to meander. It's a way of dissipating energy. They will do it over time, even at lower levels. It just takes a lot of time. Bill's trying to goose that process along by putting these things in key places. He'll tell you real quickly, don't try this at home, because it involves, you gotta know some geomorphology, and you gotta be able to do some math, and some kind of thing. But the basic idea is that we take these degraded and incised systems with some very simple geoengineering, rocks and sticks, carefully positioned, begin to get these systems back into health. So, whoops, where'd it go? Did I hit the wrong button? I see it there. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example from a project that Kuvira directed and still directs 15 years later. This is up on Comanche Creek. This is in the National Forest Land, northern New Mexico. And what's happening here, this system was highly degraded. It had every Old West sin you can think of. So those are logging roads. This is private land, heavily logged, a very large cattle herd, and a gold mining district, all within this one prospect. Probably not a coincidence that the landowner, which was Pennzoil at the time, gave the land to the Forest Service for a tax break. 1982, 1981. So the Forest Service got this land. It had been heavily used and badly damaged. Pennzoil actually didn't. It was all really before Pennzoil got it. But anyway, so this is a pretty typical story in the West where you've got these sort of heavily used and then degraded landscapes for a lot of reasons. So so I got a call from a fishing organization. This is habitat for Rio Grande cutthroat trout, which is the state fish in New Mexico, one of the 2 native species. And I got a call from a fishing group that's very concerned about getting this habitat back to health for the fish, which is drifting towards the Endangered Species Act. So I called Bill, who knew this land, and we got involved in a long project here to get this thing restored to health, not through litigation, not through hammering on the Forest Service, but through a collaborative, cooperative project focused on improving land health with the cooperation of the ranchers here as well. But what we did is we got in here principally and asked pretty serious questions about what's wrong with this system. And again, Bill has these ideas. These are called post veins, where you put these structures that turn the creek away from this bank here very simply, again, it's some math involved and some other things, but he puts them very carefully where you turn the creek away using just very simple structures. And here's a good example. This is an overlong, what he called an overlong meander here, biting into this bank, which if you're a fish, this is bad because all that sediment's coming into the system, particularly at high water events. And what we did here is we built this structure right here. It's about 6 logs and a rock pile that creates a pillow of water, and he turned the creek just with that structure right here, carefully positioned. And then this is about 3 years later. That system healed up pretty darn well, actually. And the typical paradigm here in these systems to get out the yellow machines that belch diesel smoke, they get in there with cement and riprap and all this kind of hard engineering. This is called soft engineering, bioengineering. But what Bill is doing here, he calls it thinking like a creek. He's saying, I'm just getting in here, and this system wants to heal itself over time. It will do this eventually. He's just sort of speeding this process up, again, with a very simple structure, carefully positioned. 3 hours of volunteer labor, some logs, and some rocks. It's gotten a little more sophisticated since then. But you can see how this system begins to heal. Bill uses a lot of what he calls one rock dams. These are literally only 1 rock tall. And Bill will tell you, if you do anything in these landscapes, don't build a check dam. As he likes to put it, creeks don't want to be lakes, they want to be creeks. And if you dam them, they will eventually undam them. And then you have all these problems again. So this is not, he calls it a dam, but it's really just a one layer of rocks. And all he's trying to do is slow water down, get water to infiltrate, grass to grow. We're not doing anything else here except slowing water down. Getting nature a break, and that's kind of what the key is here. So the grazing that we talked about earlier, that cattle ranching, is about moving animals around and letting that land recover, in a sense, rest for 98% of the year. So it's giving a break from the pressure of grazing. This is a break in these systems so that water can grow in. Bill likes to say that we overlook the obvious problems and go right for the big ones. So in these systems, what roads do to landscapes, I'm sure Mike can tell you, ranch roads, if they're poorly designed and poorly maintained, can unwind a landscape faster than almost anything else. So this is, if you're a fish in this system here, and you can see that sediment pool right there, that's coming from this culvert right there underneath the road. So badly placed culverts create these tremendous ecological problems. What I loved about Bill and why we started to work with him, he would push aside all politics and positions. He'd say, what are the real problems here? And the real problem here is this culvert. And so we got in there. This is with EPA funding, back when the EPA used to fund Clean Water Act kinds of projects. You can see how it healed up here. And then we put the structure in here and grass started to grow. In wet systems, even in dry New Mexico, these systems recover quickly if you give them a break. But you gotta ask the right questions, you gotta solve the right problems. And Bill will tell you, you can't solve the problems if you don't know your ecology. You gotta know what the processes are about. So this is an example of how to fix roads. He wrote a book, it's got the very sexy title, Water Harvesting from Low Standard Rural Roads. It's a really important book. We sold a lot of copies of this because roads can really tear up landscapes, and Bill's got a whole way of fixing these things. We did a lot of workshops on this. So here's another pop quiz. Who thinks this is a healthy landscape? Does anybody know what this is? This is in the Carson National Forest, not far from the project site. It's a wet meadow. And wet meadows are incredibly important biologically to these, especially in dry country. So this is a wet meadow. Does it look like a healthy wet meadow to you? No, there's something wrong with it, right? It's got this erosion thing going right up the middle here. It should be a nice flat wet meadow. Anybody take a guess as what caused that erosion? Before we fix it, you got to figure out what's causing the problem. Anybody take a guess? A road. Well, specifically, a badly placed culvert under that road. And they create these little dry waterfalls, they're called head cuts, and that head cut will migrate upstream, uphill with every storm to eventually, and what the problem here is, that this is the old water table is right here, the water table is now down here, so this is all drying up. I don't care if you're a cow, or an elk, or a turkey, or a fisherman, this is not good. These wet meadows are critical. When they dry up like this and the water table falls, all kinds of things. So the Forest Service here knew it had a problem. Here's its solution. What did I just tell you? Creeks don't want to be lakes. They want to be creeks. So the Forest Service here dammed this system, trying to stop this erosion. It's a 6-foot drop. What do you think is going to happen here? Unless you maintain this constantly, and the Forest Service has not got the facilities or the people to do this, this system will eventually, this system will undercut here, this will all blow out, all that sediment will move, and as Bill likes to say, it'll be much worse than if you'd done nothing in this system, because all that sediment will now scour out. Don't build a dam, don't make a creek into a lake if it doesn't want to be a lake, it wants to be a creek. So what does Bill do? So Bill, in the same system not far away, will take, this is a head cut in a wet meadow, eventually will drain this hole all the way up and cause all kinds of problems. Bill has lots of methodologies. I'm just going to show you a couple of them here. One of them. So he puts down filter fabric and then builds that one rock dam. It's just one rock high. And all he's doing is slowing water down. It's going to sink in. That filter fabric is biodegradable. It'll eventually disappear, and all the grass and stuff grows up through it. It's a process that has proven effective. It's interesting, the regulating agencies, when we got started with this, all of them, particularly the Army Corps of Engineers, which regulates a lot of the watersheds and in-stream flows and things, all said, no. What are you talking about? You can't do this. Now they all say yes, because they understand this works. Here's a good example. Here's a post vein here. It looks like the system, now, does this look healthy to you? This is a system that's recovering. It's getting better. It's interesting, this is an exclosure here to keep the willows protected, not from cows, but from elk. The elk don't read the instruction book. They get in here, they go, thank you for all this grass, and they eat everything down, particularly woody species like the willows. The Forest Service here knew it had an elk problem. There's a big elk herd here. It built a mile square elk exclosure around the creek. I'd never seen so much elk poop inside the elk exclosure in my life. It didn't work. They tore it down eventually. Bill came up with this idea that you build these kind of postage stamp exclosures around the willows. Nothing will want to jump in there. They don't like it. They don't jump in there. They leave it alone, and this stuff grows. So here's a system that's recovering through some very simple bioengineering structures. Again, thinking like a creek, using nature to heal nature, and that's kind of one of the key messages here tonight. Like the cattle ranchers that we work with are using the grazing behavior of herbivores to restore these systems and to get them to work functionally. Bill is also doing the same thing in these creeks. It's also a lot of fun. We have a lot of volunteers, a lot of folks come out. They want to give something back to nature. They want to get mud on their shoes. And this is a project that's been going on for 15 years. We've been up and down this creek. It's doing really well. The fish is back. It's been a big collaborative success. We have some other challenges dealing with bureaucracies, but that's kind of a different issue. But this stuff works. And we started with Bill 2001, 2002. Nobody believed it. Now Bill is in demand everywhere. This is one other quick project on private lands in eastern New Mexico, just kind of show you how this works. This was a farm. This is what the previous owner did to his farm, not dumping tires because it's a garbage dump, but because what? He's trying to save the farm from erosion. This is a river, it's called the Dry Cimarron River. It goes right through the farm, and it was destroying the farm land. Because of all those erosion issues I talked about before. The farmer here was trying to stop the erosion. He eventually threw up his hands. He actually built a dam. He just went and built a dam across the river. Every regulator came out of the woodwork. You can't build dams across rivers. So he gave up. So his daughter came to us and said, I want to save the farm. What do I do? So we hired Bill to get the system back into health. The farmer had actually cut off the meanders and straightened the river up, and down it went. So we actually had to use yellow machines here to re-meander the system. And we built a lot of one rock dams and the side channels to slow water down. And then this was the response. You can see, here's the farm here. Here's the old cut that was eating up the farmland. By putting this one structure right here, Bill turned the water away from the bank, and all this grew. None of it was planted. This is all voluntary. There's lots of seed in the soil. You just got to give it some water and a chance to grow. So you can see here what it looks like. This is back when it used to rain more in New Mexico. But look at all this response. Here's one of those one rock dams. Here's the main stem of the river. Again, nothing happened here except a little bit of sticks and rocks in careful places. Pretty amazing. And this is Bill, and Bill is he's like the Aldo Leopold of the 21st century, just thinking about how systems work. What would nature do here? Not what we would do here. What would nature do here? Let's try to push that process along. So Bill has written a book about this. If you are interested in this, it's available from Chelsea Green Press, which is the same press that published my books. It's a manual, it's 250 pages. It's all you ever want to know and more about restoring these systems to health. And there's math in this book, I warn you right now. Bill was, we would organize these workshops. Some of them were technical, but my favorite workshops are the ones where Bill would just walk across the land and he'd stop and he'd say, what's going on here? And we'd all stop and we'd look at the landscape, trying to figure out what's happening? Why is this erosion here and not over there? What's happening to this plant? So it all starts with those kinds of questions. And I'm going to come back to this book in a sec. So this was kind of the second phase of Kuvira. We started with ranchers. We moved into ecological restoration. The same kind of principles. Nature knows best. Nature's been around a long time. Let's kind of figure out what nature can teach us, which is what Bill did in these systems. I'm going to talk very briefly about a grass bank. This is how I, the Sierra Club activist, became a dues-paying member of the New Mexico Cow Growers Association. So this was a pilot project outside of Santa Fe, set up by this guy here, Bill DeWeese, who's a well-known writer in the Southwest, worked for the Conservation Trust at the time. And he talked them, which is an environmental group, into purchasing the permit for the 36,000-acre Forest Service allotment. No cows on it at the time. Instead of putting cows on it, Bill offered it as a grass bank to neighboring ranchers to bring their cows on it. What Bill was trying to do was trying to get ecological restoration going, principally forest thinning and burning, which was controversial at the time, not so much today. But to get ecological systems up to health here in forested systems, you need to do some thinning and burning. Bill is trying to mitigate the conflict with the ranchers by taking the cows off the home ground to get restored and put them on the grass bank for about 3 to 4 years. We took it over in 2004. First thing we did was make a land health map. This is the same idea I showed you before. Red is not healthy, green is healthy. We wanted to ask that basic question, what's healthy, what's not healthy, before we asked why and what do we do about it. In this case, health is tied to tree encroachment in meadows. You can see here all these little trees coming in. That's why this is orange and this is a meadow here. Kind of a lot of background issues here about forests. Basically, though, if you're going to manage these landscapes to improve them, get them back into health, your toolbox is fairly limited. There's only a few things we got. Cows can be a tool, if managed well. Fire is a tool. You can thin mechanically or some combination thereof. That's about it. That and rest, about all the tools that we have in these landscapes. So kind of leap forward a little bit. The grass bank struggled for a number of reasons, mostly financially and also some issues with the Forest Service. So Kuvira ended up getting the cattle business. We needed actually to try to make some money off of this ranch. I had a board member, a cattle rancher, who said, Courtney, this has all the costs of a ranch and no income. And I thought, yeah, that's true, that's a problem. So we ended up running our own cattle herd. This is where we became a dues-paying member of New Mexico Cattle Growers Association. But this led to a very important moment for me. We ended up getting involved in food. So we ended up, in order to make some money from this, we ended up marketing our animals as grass-fed to Santa Fe. So Santa Fe is a wealthy market. And thanks to Michael Pollan and Barbara Kingsolver, there was a fair amount of education already gone on about grass-fed. And grass-fed just means the animal's on grass its entire life. which is how nature wants animals to live, not in feedlots eating grain. So we ended up getting into the grass-fed business. We had just a small herd. This wasn't kind of a big deal for us. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about food, and in particular how food becomes the glue to bring all these different groups together. Not only people have to eat, but they are concerned about where the food comes from, those kinds of things. In 2006, when we started this, it was relatively novel for all of us. Now it's pretty well known, of course. But this was a conservation group getting in the cattle business to provide local grass-fed food. So this was kind of a neat deal for us. Excuse me, I ended up going to the Slow Food Gathering in Italy as a grass-fed producer, which was interesting for me. City boy, grew up in Phoenix, became a Sierra Club activist. Now I'm a grass-fed cattle rancher. Interesting. Life, takes you places. So now I'm gonna try to put these different pieces together. So 2009, I asked a question, and I wrote a grant to a foundation. I asked the question, what would happen? Oh wait. So then, I'm sorry. Before that, I became concerned about some larger issues, climate, some other things, and we actually ended up putting the word resilience in our mission statement here. Resilience just means the ability to bounce back from change, from a forest fire or a bankruptcy or whatever. Are you resilient? And actually, for me, it came out of New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, where New Orleans wasn't very resilient, right? It was these issues. So we began to think about how these larger elements in our world are expressed locally. So how do we build resilience in these landscapes? And then, of course, we've got some climate issues now that raise this question of resilience rather dramatically, I'd say. And I just call it The Age of Consequences, which is a book that's over there. So I asked this foundation this question. I sat down and I said, what if you combined the new ranch, which is the cattle grazing, the progressive cattle grazing, plus Bill Zedike's methodologies of restoring these degraded riparian systems, plus local food, local grass-fed food. What would happen if you combine those things together? Would you get something like a carbon negative, carbon neutral kind of, I had no idea. I just wrote the grant to try to find out if you're actually restoring grass to these ranges, fixing the creeks and producing local food, whether somehow the carbon footprint, this is 2009, I didn't even heard the term carbon footprint at this point. And we got the grant, so we ended up exploring this question. And in the same summer, I saw this publication. This led me to those books that are sitting over there. So this is from the World Watch Institute, and what we had been doing is working on this. This is the Kuvira Coalition, working on food and land use, right? So local grass-fed food, fixing creeks, working on grazing management, collaboratively, that kind of stuff. I had not thought of any kind of climate connection at all. And so when I saw this, I thought, what are they talking about? I don't understand this at all. So I opened it up, and this is what I read. More than 30% of all greenhouse gases arise from land use sector, and there's no strategy for mitigating climate change can be complete without reducing emissions. Moreover, and what's orange here is what's important, only land-based terrestrial carbon sequestration offers the possibility of large-scale removal of greenhouse gases. And what that means, very quickly, a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through photosynthesis, plants, green plants, pulling down CO2. They break the C off from the O2. Carbon is the C, O2 is oxygen. Oxygen goes back up. For us, yay, good news. C goes lots of places, but eventually a lot of it goes down into the soils. That's what they're saying here. Through plant photosynthesis, we actually can soak up a lot of carbon. I didn't know that. I mean, I hadn't thought about it. So I kept reading. It's called the carbon cycle. It's actually, I think, the most important cycle on the planet. We've got lots of cycles, but this is a graph we made. Basically, the carbon cycle is around photosynthesis brings CO2 into the ground. You've got animals, and then eventually goes back up through plant respiration. And here's the problem, we are adding to the cycle. We're adding too much CO2. The planet cycles it. It can handle it. It's kind of like a thermostat. It goes up and down. The problem is we are putting extra CO2 into the cycle, and it can't handle it. This is the issue. So, but could we cycle some of that CO2 out through better land management? That was my question. So in this book, in this little pamphlet, I read this. So the 5 strategies they said for reducing and sequestering carbon were enriching soil carbon. If anybody's a gardener, you know what that means. That's that dark, rich soil in your garden. That's mostly carbon. 58% of soil organic matter is carbon. Enriching soil carbon, farming with perennials. That just means grass, basically, not annuals, corns and annuals. So perennials are grasslands. Climate-friendly livestock production, which I've already discussed. Protecting natural areas, keeping open space open, largely. And then finally, restoring degraded watersheds. And I read that and I thought, holy smokes, that's the Kuvira Coalition. That's what we've been doing. I didn't realize that a climate context or a climate connection. We've been working on all of this stuff just for land management purposes, trying to get land restored to health, produce some healthy food from it. So now suddenly there's a climate connection, which led to Grass Soil Hope, which is out there, which led to this map that I showed you in the beginning of this talk. So I sat down in 2010 in advance of our annual conference and asked myself, what were all of the regenerative, resilient, sustainable, practices that I could think of, that I knew from my experience, could we put them on one sort of mythical landscape, which is what you got here. So you've got cattle ranching, you've got creek restoration, you've got farming, you've got cities and food systems, you've got renewable energy, you've got beavers and irrigated ground, all this sort of stuff, all kind of, and I intentionally took out any fences. None of this is public land versus private land. This is all one kind of mythical landscape. And I asked, what could we do to increase carbon storage, reduce emissions, and generally increase productivity and fertility of these landscapes? And that led to a conference we did in 2010 called the Carbon Ranch. This is the idea, how can we affect climate change? How could we improve our chances through land management, not just reducing the amount of carbon that's going out of these plants, but actually being soaked up into these landscapes. And in the process of putting the book together and doing the conference, I found out there's a lot going on around the world. It's actually pretty exciting. This is John Wick, who is the first chapter in the book. He's in the Marin Carbon Project, which is Marin, California, where they are trying to actually very carefully measure how much carbon is being stored in soils through cattle management on his ranch. Really one of the first projects to kind of think about this in any meaningful way. And this is a rancher, Tom Sidwell, out in eastern New Mexico, and Tom is one of the best ranchers I know. He's turned a degraded ranch that he bought with his wife into a very productive grass-fed ranch where I know he's sequestering more carbon. He doesn't think of himself that way. He's not. I'm not a carbon rancher. I don't particularly care about those issues, but he wants healthy landscapes. This is Dorn Cox, he's a farmer in New Hampshire, who is in the book doing his PhD on different kinds of carbon uses in soils. He invented a biodiesel with some friends, so he grows all his own energy through canola, things like that. So he biodiesels at the farm, reduces his energy input. He thinks of himself and calls himself a carbon farmer. He's in his mid-30s. He really looks at the world through a carbon lens, meaning climate, meaning how do we do this? How can I help? He has a family farm. It's organic, but his parents didn't think about these issues. Dorn thinks about these issues. He's a very interesting person. He actually was told there's no future in farming, so he left the farm when he was young. He went to college, then he went to Wall Street, and he got involved eventually in high-tech stuff. Went around the world, learned about systems theory and complexity and all that kind of stuff, and then said, forget it. He went back to the farm, but he brought with him all that he had learned. He has a great quote. He says, farming isn't rocket science, it's more complicated than that. And that's what he does. He carbon farms. So he's got, he floats these little balloons up, and he takes pictures down, his infrared imagery. It's all shared through the internet with other farmers. None of it's proprietary. This biodiesel thing that he built is open source, so all the plans are out there. It's all, he's not making money from any of this. He just wants to share it and solve these problems. This is an example of the next generation really thinking about these issues in terms of whereas folks, when we got started, it was more about the cattle and the land and the water. They're trying to put all this together in a climate context. So he's in the book. Colin Seiss is a farmer in Australia who does pasture cropping, which I described. In this case, he is he's seeding an annual crop in perennial pasture. It sounds technical, but it just means he's growing oats in pasture. So he's getting 2 crops from one plot of land. It's how nature wants things growing together. It doesn't like these things all split up and kept apart. Humans like that, nature doesn't like it. So this is an annual and a perennial system together, pasture cropping. And the carbon content of these soils is phenomenal. And when you increase the carbon content of the soil, it holds more water. It's got more porosity, it just holds more water molecules, so the water holding capacity of these soils goes up, good for drought, where we are, maybe not for Seattle, but we need every water drop we can get. So he pioneered this system where they put annuals and perennials together in very much a way that nature would do these systems. And so I ended up flowing all this into Grass Soil Hope, which Chelsea Green published. Michael Pollan wrote a forward for it. And the idea, let's think of these landscapes through a carbon lens. You can still talk about food and cattle and water, but let's think about its positive effects on climate change. And they actually have done the math. Rangelands, grasslands are the largest biome on the planet, a terrestrial biome on the planet. There's more rangelands than anything else. If you could actually wave a magic wand and increase the carbon storage in those grasslands around the world, you can soak up all the excess CO2 in the atmosphere. It's harder than that, but they just penciled it out, just saying, hey, the potential's there. Let's think about this. And this actually has now led to kind of a lot of stuff going on, including what happened in Paris a couple months ago. So I wrote this, and that actually led to the book that's also out there called 2% Solutions. I found as I was doing the research, all these other stories that weren't making it into the book. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of innovation. We as a species, we're creative, we're ingenious, we're destructive, but we're also pretty smart. And so there's a lot of folks out there trying to solve this problem, thinking about it at a grassroots level. A lot of those stories didn't make it into the book, so I ended up writing some short profiles. So biochar is an example, going back to animal power, rather using diesel, using animals to help on the farm. Cooperatives, this is just a kind of a sampling. Topsoiling, this is keyline plowing, which maybe sounds a little technical, but there's a plow that an Australian invented. So I found in my research, and when people ask, what's the one thing I can do for the planet? And you go to conferences, people always wave their hand, what's the one thing I do for the planet? Generally, the answer is stop eating red meat. That's not correct. 2 things about meat. I'm not saying that folks should eat meat, but if you do eat meat from a carbon farm and a carbon ranch, and they're out there. I mean, they're grass-fed, that kind of stuff. But I found through this research, and I didn't know this, the one thing we can do for the planet is to stop plowing, stop tilling, stop turning soil over. It decarbonizes these landscapes. Hang on one sec. Decarbonize these landscapes. The biology in the soil, the microbes and the protozoas, the nematodes, all down there doing their thing. If you turn the soil over, it exposes them to wind and sun and heat and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of them die. So we lose the fertility, natural biological fertility in the soil. If you don't plow, you don't turn it over, that fertility stays there, that system stays intact, and it's a system called no-till. It's kind of a whole thing behind it. No-tilling means kind of a thin cut across these soils with a no-till drill, drops the seed in. If you can do it organically in particular, that's kind of a little complicated, then you can grow. I'm almost done. Can you hold on to your question until we're done? Okay. So plowing is an issue, tilling is an issue. Nature doesn't have animals turning soil over a foot deep, right, and plowing across the landscapes. So fiber sheds, this is a young woman in the Bay Area, California, that is trying to get, she asked, I think, a very good question. We talk about watersheds, we talk about food sheds. Where do our clothes come from? Our clothes have a big environmental impact. And so she's trying now to start a fiber shed in the Bay Area where everything's produced locally, organically, sustainably. Those kinds of things. So there's another farm in California. where they never stop farming. They don't stop farming. They don't take the winter off. They farm year-round. He hothouses vegetables, and then when they pull the plant out, he puts another plant in. He's got a CSA. He's making a lot of money. Building topsoil, compost, local food, grass-fed, organic, and he's making decent money, hires a full-time staff, year-round farming. Just these little models, these pockets of innovation out there, people trying to solve this larger problem. And then a ranch in Texas where he put all these different parts together. He put keyline plowing and Bill Zedike and cattle grazing on this West Texas ranch that was highly degraded when he bought it. His name was Christopher Gill, and he put all these things together, and it's just gone phenomenal. He talked at our conference last year. He loves drones. He flies drones over his farm, his ranch, to get these. And it's amazing. If you look down from a drone, what you see, we're used to looking out. If you look down, it's a whole different world. So he takes these amazing drone images, but he's recovered the ranch. He's a wildlife guy. And the wildlife is back, but he manages, he key lines, no-tills, the soil that's compacted, grass grows, he brings the cows in to manage the grass, fixes the creeks, he's got it all together on his one landscape. And he doesn't like to spend money, so he can do it all for $10 an acre, which is pretty incredible, actually. So anyway, so I found all these different stories, and was excited by what I was learning and hearing about, and I put them together in this book, which is over here, which is 50 of them, 50 low-cost ways. They're short profiles with pictures, trying to reach an audience that may not, students and journalists and things who may not think about these issues generally. And at this kind of climate food nexus, which is what we're talking about. And so that book is out there. There are other stories. I just picked 50. There's a kind of a lot going on around the world. It's all at the grassroots level. It's largely off the radar screen, media radar screen. You don't hear a lot about it, but there's really a tremendous amount of stuff. We need to scale it up, and that's the challenge we have. When I started in 1997, at the beginning of this talk, I talked about the Kuvira Coalition. There were just kind of a number of push pins on the map, not very many of them, frankly. If you go forward now, there's a lot more push pins on these maps. I mean, there's a lot going on, particularly driven by young people today, young farmers and ranchers and other folks and food systems. So we have a lot more today. I think in the Seattle area, you probably have examples of this. The challenge that we have, though, and this is a big one, is how to go to something like this. We're not anywhere near this yet. Right? What I try to tell folks is that it's not a matter of innovation anymore. We have the solutions. We know what to do. I mean, it's been 20, 25, 30 years of beta testing creeks and cattle and food and organic. We know what to do. We know how to do it. Now you have to figure out how to get it up to scale. And this is the challenge. You need an economy that values this. We have a climate crisis on. Theoretically, you can make those links between the climate and the food and the land. However, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, we need a functioning political system. That would be nice. We need policy changes, farm bill, whatever, to make this stuff work. That ain't happening, and so there's a big roadblock in front of all this. So there's all this innovation at the ground, at the grassroots level. And groups like the Nature Conservancy get it, and they're really doing a lot of cool stuff. But we still have to figure out how to get up and over these policy barriers that are in the way in order to try to get this stuff scaled up. So in our conference, we've tried to deal with a lot of these issues, how we're going to feed all these people, kind of the back to the future sort of idea, because we're really going back to ideas that we gave up 50, 60 years ago, grass-fed food. We're all grass-fed organic eaters 60, 70 years ago. I gave it up. And what's neat about this, as I said before, there's a tremendous interest at the next generation level. Kuvira started an apprenticeship program. We put young people on ranches, well-managed ranches. We can't fill the need for one apprenticeship position. 100 applicants apply, and it's so hard to turn down the 99 that don't get a chance to go and work on a farm or ranch. There's some funding issues, meaning there's some challenges there. There's lots of farmers and ranchers that want to teach. There's a lot of folks who want to learn. We're trying to figure out how to bring those dots together. And fortunately, I mean, again, as I said before, we don't need to look for the mentors. They're out there. The stuff has been, as I said before, beta tested, on the ground for 30, 40 years. These folks are, including Aldo Leopold, meaning we still take a lot of inspiration from folks in the past, but there's a lot of knowledge now, a lot of experience, a lot of problem solving, a lot of beta testing, as I said. Now the challenge is how to figure out to get that information transferred across to folks who want to implement it and do it. So those are the two things that are in front of us. How do you get that economy up and running that can put this stuff at scale, and how do you get the workforce, which is really the next generation to do this. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you much. We have a man with a burning question here.
Just letting you know, we have 15 minutes for Q&A, and to use one of these two mics, and keep your questions fairly brief so we can get to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, when you got to Michael Pollan and whether we should eat meat or not, I kind of flipped out there a little bit. But I come from where you come from, going back to the 50s, with Leopold's teachers being students being my teachers. So I go back to when Aldo was still alive at Madison, and I spent my whole life in conservation and land use. So where I'm asking here is, the foundation of the food system and its corporate structure and the emphasis on meat as opposed to the emphasis on grain, as opposed to now out here with what Gail and I are trying to do with the fisheries. So the do and don't eat fish, definitely after Hayes don't eat meat, and somewhere in between we should all be living on lentils, but we don't want to plow the landscape. So where do you put these three major factors of our food back to the local level where we can work the conservation to get those major dynamics in one place?
Right, hear the question? Can we turn the lights up? I feel like I'm being sort of staring right into the bright lights here. Well, yeah, so you've asked kind of the $64,000 question, is how do you begin to put this all together in a food system that makes sense? I mean, I assume that most folks here understand how the industrial food system works. Most meat, in fact, like 96% of the meat comes from feedlots in the industrial food system, where cattle eat grain. Cattle are not designed by nature to eat grain. They have to give them medicine or they'll die, they blow it up. So there's a whole system that values cheap food, all the subsidies and inputs that go into our food system that have deleterious effects on a lot of levels, our health, the environment, I mean, you name it, all to produce a lot of cheap food and to support a sort of a corporate agricultural system that frankly benefits economically from it. So it's a system that's large, it's monolithic, it's hard to break through that system. What folks are doing around the edges of it are beginning to figure out how to direct market and introduce the way nature would have done things. So if you're a meat eater, you don't have to be a meat eater, but if you do choose to eat meat, go to a farmer ranch that is doing this kind of stuff, that's doing holistic management or fixing creeks, got carbon sensitivity to it. They're out there. I'm sure in the Seattle area, I don't know where they are here, but I'm sure you've got grass-fed and organic farms and ranches around here. Those are the ones that you want to support. You don't want to get into this meat versus vegetable thing, because do folks understand what soybeans, industrial scale soybean agriculture does to the Midwest? I mean, it's not like that. We want to ask the system: is it environmentally sound? Would nature do this if it could? Those kinds of questions. I don't know about fish, to be honest with you. I don't know fish systems very well. I wrote in the book about aquaponics, and when I talked about aquaponics is a way of circulating water between a vegetable garden and a fish tank, round and round. It's different than fish farms, which are very terrible. Or anyway, so there's ways of mimicking ecological systems that involve fish, but I don't know much about that. But again, if you get into what we eat, You want to ask, how's the food produced? Is it a benefit to us in our health and to nature? And there's lots of alternatives now and choices now that you didn't have 20 years ago, which is pretty cool. We buy all our meat from that rancher that I showed, Tom Sidwell, partly because I love his management, and so I feel I like writing him a check and handing it to him that helps him steward that landscape. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's voting for the stuff with our checks, our dollars, is really the one thing we can all do right now as we try to figure out how to manage these landscapes.
Just that people in the city that have lost now with over half the population of the country living urban, people don't know what to believe because there's strong writers and speakers who are saying cows are killing us.
Right.
One is right here in the Bullitt Foundation. He just wrote the book about cows.
Right. So yeah. Yeah, and I'm aware of, so Dennis Hayes wrote a book about cows. So this is a whole kind of another topic. I don't know if we have time to get into it. The antipathy towards the bovine has always amazed me. I mean, it's, I don't get it. And Mike can also talk about this. If you go back historically, human civilization had a very symbiotic relationship with the bovine, right? And then suddenly about after World War II, began to demonize them. And again, cows they eat they do what they do. It's their management. It's really the humans and how they manage the cows. They let them linger in the riparian areas. They don't move them. They eat down. They overgraze. Everybody gets upset. And the animal's still doing what the animal does. The animal's not behaving, it's still eating the grass exactly the same way. So the way this demonization of the bovine, when it's just an animal, it's just an animal, right? I mean, and not looking at the management issues behind the animals is a mistake, frankly. I mean, it's interesting for me when I got started trying to convince environmentalists to understand what ranchers are up to, particularly ranchers who are doing a good job. What really changed the equation was understanding the open space issues. That ranchers own a lot of the West. I mean, a lot of the West is privately owned by ranchers. If you drive them out of business, the land gets sold, that open space gets broken up. So that began to shift, and then folks began to ask questions about how should these landscapes be managed. And the whole issue in Oregon with the Bundys is heartbreaking on a lot of levels. But I have read, behind the scenes that they're not good cattle ranchers. They don't do a good job of stewardship. It's kind of undergirding all of that discussion. So yes, so there's a movie called Cowspiracy. There's been books for decades about all this stuff. They kind of conveniently sidestep good cattle management because it doesn't fit their argument, or they just make a mockery of whoever. It's just not true. Just not true. And Mike can tell you, because he managed a ranch, there is a way to do this right and there's a way to do it wrong, as I showed you in that slide. And he wants to ask a question. So.
Yeah, thank you. As someone who lives in the city and people in the suburbs, I'm wondering if you have some comments about how people in the city or suburbs could be more carbon farmers. I mean, there's a lot of things on permaculture, and right. My wife had been talking and seeing all these grass strips in front of sidewalks that are just filled with grass instead of like lots of food production or carbon right. Capturing systems or something. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, and what sort of proportion, right. if cities and suburbs started really right. doing more of this, would that contribute to more yes. carbon capturing?
So yes, so the role of urban in all of us, because we talked a lot about rural, right, farms and ranches, and there's some chapters in the book about kind of the urban side of this. I mean, there's an urban agriculture movement underway. I talk about rooftop farming in New York City, Boston. I mean, it's small scale, but they're trying to grow food and also sequester carbon in the cities. And so there's actually a number of things that can be done. The farm that I showed, the Never Stop Farming, are right up against the city. So you can two things. One, you can manage your little plot of land for carbon gardening, or you can try to get the neighborhood to kind of think about these things. That's small scale, but you buy food from somewhere, right? You eat food. Your water comes from a watershed. How you can spend that money, how you can advocate for good watershed management, supporting the work of the Nature Conservancy, for example, is a way to also activate your urbanness, I guess. Does that make sense? So that so there's something that you can directly manage if you can. In terms of climate, it's probably not going to have, I mean, we need large-scale carbon sequestration to affect the climate. However, if everybody who lived in Seattle ate a certain way, and all that money flowed directly to farmers and ranchers who did manage land at scale, it would have a hell of an impact. Then we get back to some of those obstacles that are in the way of that, policy and the industrial food system. But there are things that folks in cities can do, and mostly I would try and encourage you to engage with the food system where you are and figure out who you can support. You have what? Pea patches in Seattle. Yeah, and and that's growing rapidly. I mean, all across the country, there's all kinds of urban agriculture going on, Detroit and other places. You had a question? Sorry.
Is there enough land for migratory grazing to feed and to supply the global demand for meat?
Well, that's a good question. So I think there's two parts to that. So meat consumption globally is rising. Can it be sustained? I don't know. Probably not. And we should probably eat less meat in general. I mean, just for our health and everything else. Is there enough grazing land, rangelands, grasslands? Yes. How many of them are managed well? Probably not a lot. Potentially they could. In New Mexico, where I am, there's lots of good grazing land. I mean, half the state is privately owned, and a lot of it is in grass or in pasture, and it supports a fairly large cattle population. How much of that's managed well or managed for carbon? Probably not as much as it could be, but they certainly could. And what's nice about this system is that when you do this kind of cattle management, you can raise the stocking rate. I don't want to get technical, but you can put more cows on that landscape. So there's a story in the book about Sam Montoya. I'll tell you real quickly. Sam Montoya is a member of a Native American tribe outside Albuquerque. He asked the tribe if he could have 93 acres of land on the reservation, and what he did was that it was an old sod farm. It had been stripped of its fertility, stripped of its soil. He put 33 pastures using electric fences on 93 acres with a central water source, and he put out 220 head of cattle. He moved them every single day. He was retired. He lived across the road, and he'd come out once a day. He'd open the gate. The cattle would move into the new paddock. He'd close the gate. He'd go, I'm retired. I don't want to work too hard. And so he put 220 cattle on 93 acres of irrigated land. It was irrigated. And if you know anything about the West, that's a high stocking rate. Generally on irrigated ground, you can run about 100, 120. He's running 220. He was moving them every single day. So a month went around the circle. He grew so much grass. I mean, he grew more grass than he knew what to do with, actually. He called himself a grass farmer, producing grass-fed. So the point is that it's not just number of acres. I mean, how many acres do we have? It's how you manage those acres. Sam only had 93 acres. Up the road, 3 miles, somewhere else on the reservation, same soil, same everything. It's a desert, complete desert. So it's same everything, except Sam just managed his land differently. So he doubled the stocking rate, and he's in the book because the issue is, how are we going to feed all these people? There's a large population on this planet, and we had to figure out how to, and it was called sustainably intensify food production. I can tell you right now, Monsanto has the answer. They say they do. And they say, we're going to sustainably intensify food production through GMOs. All right? Sam has doubled the stocking rate on his little plot, put 220 head instead of 120 head, grass-fed, well-managed. You can do it that way, or we can do it the other way. And that's what we're going to be having to choose from here. So I'm trying to say it's not just amount of acres, how many acres do we have, it's what do you do with those acres, and if you manage them well, think of the herd of bison, right, moving around. Sam's got a herd of bison, except he's got them in 33, he's got them in one paddock, he moves every day around his 93 acres, grows a lot of grass. It was an amazing, and the sad thing is I hate to put a damper on it is that he could not get anyone on the reservation, young people interested in what he was doing. There was a casino and all that stuff, all that money, and no one is interested in agriculture. And he eventually retired from that as well, and the farm has gone out of business. But the point is that you can sustainably intensify food production this way using nature's model. And if we don't, though, Monsanto is going to get its way and say, we're going to do it this other way, because we have to feed all these people. They have to be fed. I mean, just have to be fed. So, other questions? Are we out of time? How are we doing? I want to ask one final question kind of about, anybody got any ideas about the radical center and our political system? Because we can't do this without a functioning political system, and I know there's, we're in the middle of the primaries and all that sort of stuff, and I'm trying to figure all this out. Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, I can tell you where I am. The Democrats aren't much more clued in about these issues, to be honest with you. And I've never met better land stewards than Republican ranchers. I mean, so it's don't draw those lines right there. It's about other kinds of issues. It's really about the willingness to work together and try to solve these problems, or just dig these trenches. And I'm very concerned about the trenches that are being dug right now.
If you get real honest about it, you've seen a decline in government confidence and
Right.
for lack of funding.
Right. Yeah, and that's actually a larger issue. You talked about government, the role of government in this, and this Mike and I were talking a little bit about this earlier. Caught in the middle of all these conflicts is the federal land agencies in particular, who've all seen their funding decline and the staff decline, and they've got all these responsibilities. They own half of the West is federally owned. Frankly, a lot of it's not poorly well managed. And so kind of behind the Bundys is this question of, are these agencies functioning well? I don't know. And then on the other side, environmentalists are concerned about these issues too. And the answer to that is to try to give these agencies more funding, but the Congress has strangled these agencies. And so that's a complicated situation as well. But yes, the role of government in this, but the role of private citizens in this, because we tend to default to the government. Well, the government will figure it out. We all have to, and that's part of the radical center, is that we're all in this together. And the last point I'll make is that, as I said before, the solutions are there. In fact, I had a lunch last fall with somebody, a friend of mine, who said, we don't need more solutions, Courtney. We got all these solutions. We know what to do. They're there. They've all been figured out. Now we have to figure out how to get them enacted, and it does require a functioning political system. So we'll just cross our fingers and hope that we get one. So, all right. All right, thank you. So I'm signing books over here, so I encourage you to go over and grab a book. I'll sit at the table over here. And thank you to Seattle Town Hall folks, wherever you are, for organizing this. Thank you for coming.